Hi, George Hepworth, Grover Park Consulting. Let's build Mike's mobile library. Today we're going to continue with the process of creating a custom connector and using that custom connector to retrieve book information from the Google Books API and store it in our PowerApps application. This is part 2. We're back in the custom connectors area of our design environment for PowerApps. Remember that custom connectors are stored under the Dataverse section of our options. We have tables, choices, etc., and custom connectors. So far we've created 2. I'm going to use the existing Google Books connector as a template or a model by which I'm going to create a new one, walk through each of the steps with you to illustrate how it's done. Let's start by creating a new custom connector from the menu. We have several options, only one of which is really appropriate to what we're doing here, and that is create from blank. We're going to give it a new name, and I'm just going to take YT Google Books. We're using this name for our YouTube example. Give it the name and start. Now, we can upload an icon for this particular connector. I'm not going to do that this time. You saw in the previous video an example of having a custom connector provided. I'm going to specify the background color. I'm going to use the example that they offer here, 007EE5. That's sort of the default, I guess. Description is, this is a test. Connect. That overtype sometimes happens when I have the recording software running. Test connector is our description. We're going to create an HTTPS request. We have an example here, and we're going to replace that with the one we want, which is the one from the Google APIs.com. This will get me into the Google API site. Within that Google API site, I want to get information about books. That's all we need here in step 1. As you can see, there are 5 steps, including a test. We move on. Authentication is not required to use this Google Books API. If we had an API which did require authentication, we would have to set it up here. Move on to the actual definition. Now you can see that I have 3 elements in the definition. First is the action. This is what it's going to do. References, reusable parameters used by both actions and triggers, not relevant to what we're doing. And policies, which are a more advanced part of the ability to create a custom connector. That's a little bit beyond where we are right now. We're going to start by adding a new action, and we'll call it YT get Google Books. As it turns out, the description is required here. So I'm just going to just call it again, test of GB API. And this is the actual ID, or the action, the name of the action that will be exposed in PowerApps that we can use to retrieve information about a book from the Google Books API endpoint. It needs to be, I'm just going to call it YT get book. No spaces in it. We got a little squiggly because it's not a valid spelling, but that will go away when we go on to the next step. Now, we're going to create the request. When you send an HTTPS request, you use GET, and then you send the URL, the endpoint, and any required query string parameters. They make it easy here by offering the opportunity to use a sample to generate the request rather than have you generate it from scratch. So we're going to do that. We click Import from Sample, and we get the dialog here on the right, Import from Sample. As I just stated, we're going to use the GET, and that limits what's available below because the other option was not necessary. Now, before we have the opportunity to import, we actually have to provide a valid URL, and I'm going to copy this rather than try to type it out. So I'm going to copy and paste it, and then I'll explain what this is. We have the HTTPS, which is the secure protocol, the Google API's site, the books section within that, and in the books section we're looking at V1 and the volumes. There are other options available there. This is the one that we need to use to get the kind of information we want about a book based on its ISBN number. The question mark to indicate we're going to append a query string, Q equals, and then keyed pair here, ISBN : and a valid, I hope I've prepped a valid ISBN number that should retrieve information. Now that we have a valid string, PowerApps recognizes that this is a valid GET request string, and so it enables or lights up the import button. If I click Import, now I get back the rest of the information I need for my custom connector. It parsed out the part of the URL that gets me to the place where I need to be, and it also parsed off the query string. In a previous version of this video, I indicated I did not think we needed to create a default response, but in testing, I discovered that that's not entirely true and that it's going to work a lot better if I add a default response. So I'm going to go ahead and include that step now. Just as we did with the default request, we click the label, add default response, and I have one prepared. We're going to paste it into the body as a sample, and then we'll use that as a sample to generate the template that this custom connector will use from now on to generate the values we need in the PowerApps from the JSON that's returned. You'll notice that it is the same structure as we looked at with the response we got back from our original request. It includes right here a title and a subtitle. I picked one that included both a title and a subtitle to make sure that I included that. Authors in an array. In a JSON file, the square brackets indicate an array, so we could have one or more authors. And again, publisher, publish date, and so on. When I import that, try it again, import, it got it that time. Now we should have everything we need in our JSON or in our custom connector to request and retrieve valid JSON files. And as you can see here, it parsed out the components that we're looking for, including subtitle, title, total items. Some of these we're not going to use. Most of them, in fact, we're going to use the published date, publisher, title, subtitle. We'll display the thumbnail in our form, but we won't actually use it. Print type, I believe, is not used, or it may be the book designation. Many of these are not useful to us, but they're available if we want to use them. So now that we have the complete custom connector request and response imported, note the comment here, the payload that is available on the response. These are the tokens that will show up as the outputs in Designer. And this is the step that I had missed in my previous video. I deleted and I'm replacing it with this one, but just so you know. We'll update the connector with this new value. It takes a few minutes. Okay, let's see if that will, if we can now test it. So we'll get an example here. We'll pass in, let's try this one, see what it does. And it returns valid JSON. And this is a book that I have on my shelf. Publisher is the A Press, all the information that we want. Scroll down here, there's the thumbnail. Again, most of this we're not going to use, and again, it returned multiple items. This second one, I'm not sure. Entertaining with Disney. This is an interesting thing, by the way, about these ISBN files. Many of them seem not to be specific, and I'm not sure exactly what's going on, but as long as I get the one that I'm looking for in the first position, I'm happy. With that, we'll close and move on. Now, before I can actually test it, I'm going to create the connector. PowerApps takes a few seconds to generate the new custom connector. There's the name by which it will be known. And it takes a few seconds. I pause here. Okay, we're back. We have our custom connector ready to go. If I close this and go back to my custom connectors list, now I have a new custom connector. If I go back in to edit again, you see the information that I previously entered, the host and the base URL, the definition, and we're skipping security because we know that we don't authenticate, although it's an option. We could authenticate if we wanted to. There's the name of it, description, the operation ID that will be exposed inside PowerApps to get data. And we have the query string, which this is how it's actually used inside of our custom connector. We could go ahead and provide more information about it. We could provide a description, the summary, a default value. We don't supply a default value because we're always asking for a new book. It's not required. That URL will work with or without a parameter. It just won't return anything. It's a string, and the drop-down type is disabled. It's past validation, and this is really the part that I wanted to get to on this screen, is that it is a valid query string parameter. So now I should be able to update it and test it. Now, in my experience, this has not always worked the way I think it should work, which is now that I have created and updated a custom connector, I should be able to go ahead and test it. What has happened on numerous occasions is that it's not finding this new connector to test with. And the only way I've been able to get to it is actually to go out, reload from scratch. Well, that was interesting. I ended up closing and restarting. For whatever reason, things went off the tracks there and I wasn't able to continue from where I was. I was debating whether to leave that in as an exercise in what can happen. I decided to edit it out because it's way too boring, but the fact that it happened is not the first time that it's happened, and it's worthwhile keeping in mind that sometimes, start over, close it, and restart it is the proper troubleshooting step, and that's what we did there. Well, after a couple of three attempts, we finally got the connection that we're trying to work with to appear in our selection. You can see that within this particular connector, we have one option. This is the YT-GetBook operation ID that, again, will be exposed in PowerApps. So we'll pass it a valid query string. Hit the test operation button. It retrieves a JSON file. We have a status 200. We got a valid response. And here is the text of that response as a JSON file. In the previous video, we went through the elements of the JSON file, including the title. If there were a subtitle, there would be a subtitle line here, an author's item, publisher, and so on. So now we know that this custom connector with the operation ID YT-GetBook is going to retrieve valid JSON files if we pass it a valid query string. Okay, we're in good shape now. Let's close this thing. Go back and look. We have 3 now. This is the one that I have been using and will continue to use. We went through the process of replicating it or duplicating it for this example for the video. I'll go ahead and delete this. We won't actually use it. Well, I take that back. I will select it inside the PowerApps application so you can see that it's there. But then once we do that last step, I'll go ahead and delete it and only use the existing one that I know works properly and has no glitches in it. For now, let's call it a day. Let's wrap this up here. This video is, I think, a little better length than some. We've gone quite a bit too long. I hope that in the process of going through this, you have seen something useful to you that you can use in your own PowerApps development. The process of creating a custom connector, calling a publicly accessible API, in this case the Google Books API, to retrieve information in the form of a JSON file into your PowerApps application. In the part 3 of this series, we will go back again into the PowerApps application itself. We'll add this test, the YouTube Google Books connector, as a test to show how that step works, and then go through the code in the PowerApps application actually using the original. Please, if you are finding these videos useful or informative or helpful in any way, please hit the like button and make sure you subscribe to the YouTube channel to encourage me to continue doing it. Thanks, and I'll see you next time.